2 months into the Iran war, the Middle East has settled into an uneasy truth. Neither fully at war nor genuinely at peace. Oil facilities are still burning, smokes hung over the horizon. The global economy is suffering from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And through all of that, one fact now stands out. The United States, for all its overwhelming military power, has failed to achieve its own strategic objectives. The decapitation strike that's supposed to force Tehran into capitulation actually turned into something very different. A war with no obvious end in sight. Till now, as many as 49 planes and drones have been lost or severely damaged. For Washington, that is not just a battlefield setback. It is a humiliation on the global stage. Because its entire political case for war has rested on the promise of a rapid victory. More broadly, this conflict is not some historical exception. It is the latest and perhaps the most important example of a stronger power failing to defeat a weaker one. So to understand why, it helps to step back. In war, outcomes are decided by 2 things: capability and will. Once a country loses either one, it will lose the war. Back in the World War I, Germany has left the battlefield with much of its army still intact, but its society had lost the will to endure the industrial-scale slaughter. Then in World War II, Germany has retained the will to fight till the very end, but its capacity to do so was destroyed by the Allied powers. Historically, militaries have used 2 broad methods to break the enemy's capability or its will. One is attrition, wearing the other side down through industrial scale, manpower, and endurance, as the Soviet Union did against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. The other approach is to open such a large technological gap that the enemy will simply cannot compete. And that was the route which the United States chose against the Imperial Japan in the Pacific Theater back in World War II. The modern version of that second approach was the second offset strategy developed by the United States in the 1980s. Faced with the Soviet Union's massive advantage on the conventional forces in Europe, Pentagon has tried to leap ahead in technology instead of just match quantity with quantity. So the bet was on quality, precision-guided munitions, advanced intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, logistics, and information warfare. When that model was tested in the 1991 Gulf War, the results looked extraordinary. Through the integration of stealth aircrafts, GPS targeting, and overwhelming coordination, the United States and its allies has dismantled Saddam Hussein's million-man army with fewer than 150 combat deaths. But the victory, however, was also badly misunderstood. The common lesson drawn from 1991 was that precision warfare itself had become a shortcut to decisive victory. But the Gulf War worked out not just because Iraq's military capacity was shattered. It was also because Iraqis' fighting will had collapsed. And that happened under a unique political setting. The coalition force had a clear, unlimited objective, which was to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. It also had broad international legitimacy, grounded in the UN Security Council authorization, which left the Iraqis diplomatically isolated. Together, these factors demoralized the Iraqi armed forces and produced a rapid result for the West. These principles later distilled into the Powell Doctrine named after the Colin Powell. So the current leaders, from Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump, have seemed to remember the military spectacle of 1991, while forgetting the political conditions which made that possible. The 2003 invasion of Iraq has deepened the illusion even further. The speed in which Saddam Hussein's downfall has created a fantasy that a country of 30 million people with a 500,000-man army could be defeated and occupied in just 40 days. Iraq fell quickly for reasons far deeper than American military strength alone, because Iraqis were no longer willing to fight for a state that had lost its own legitimacy. Since the Iran-Iraqi War of the 1980s, the country had been battered by one costly conflict after another. The state was exhausted. Society had been hollowed out. The public anger toward the regime ran so deep that many Iraqis actually regarded the American invasion as liberation, even though they regret later. That mood was enough to ensure large parts of the Iraqi military conducted only token resistance to avoid the punishment after the war. So, what brought down the Saddam Hussein regime was not simply the accuracy of American bombs. It was actually the collapse of a state that had already been decaying from within for 3 decades. So that kind of collapse cannot be manufactured on demand by the outside powers. Ukraine actually makes the same point from the opposite direction. In the first month of the war, Russia has seized around 40% of its territories and has encircled tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops in places like Mariupol. For many states, that level of battlefield disaster would have been fatal. Back in World War II, Germany only had to overrun 20% of the French territory before France surrendered Paris and capitulated altogether. Ukraine, on the other hand, did not break because its will did not break. Russia has planned to win by destroying Ukraine's military capacity, but it also underestimated the ability of a modern state to preserve cohesion under invasion. So the political technology of the 21st century matter here. Social media, mass communications, they all give Kyiv a powerful tool to build a national identity and share the public opinion against Russia. Even though the country was only founded after 1991, still doubtful if it's an actual country. But there was another layer as well. The NGOs, the civil defense groups, and the disaster relief networks all helped to train the Ukrainian civilians in peacetime with the skill sets that could be fit for war. So in effect, they become a social infrastructure for the mass mobilization. Now, 4 years into the war, with at least 500,000 casualties, Ukraine is still standing. Not because it matched Russia in the raw military power, but because its own resilience has proved harder to destroy than many of the Western generals expected. But unlike Ukraine, Iran did not enter this war with anything close to national cohesion. Since 2017, the Islamic Republic already faced 4 waves of protests that were serious enough to threaten the regime, and every one of them ended in the bloodshed. The state was under strain in other ways too. Decades of sanctions pushed Iran into a so-called resistance economy. So basically concentrating power in the hands of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. By the eve of war, IRGC was no longer just one pillar of the system. In many ways, it has become the system. So on paper, Iran still looked formidable. It had around 600,000 men under arms. But that figure actually concealed a deep imbalance. Nearly 70% of these forces belong to the Artish, which is the regular military. But the Artish had been starved of money, prestige, and political influence for years. It only received about 1/3 of the budget that was allocated to the RRGC. Its old F-14 squadrons, once symbols of Iranian air power, had decayed to the point in which even the radar installation became a struggle. And some of the units were forced to rely on the North Korean missiles to remain functional. The contrast between these two military branches had grown so sharp that only raised a larger question. Was Iran still a coherent state with 2 military branches? Or it has been completely captured by a powerful Revolutionary Guard? From the American and Israeli point of view, the answer seemed obvious. You destroy the IRGC, and the Artish will have no reason to keep fighting. After decades of living under the shadow, it might even choose to cooperate with the United States. To be fair, in the purely operational terms, the plan to break the IRGC seems reasonable, because the backbone of its military power was the missile arsenal. Before the war happened, Iran has possessed more than 3,000 ballistic missiles, but most of them had ranges under 800 kilometers, enough to strike American bases in the Gulf, but not much further. Iran did have these longer range systems, capable of reaching Israel at around 2,000 kilometers. But the problem was not the missile itself, it was a missile launcher base, because Iran only had around 400 of them. Across the table, the United States possessed more than 500,000 JDAM kits, which is able to turn the ordinary bombs into the precision-guided munitions on a massive scale. If Washington had only devoted even 1/5 of that stock to the Middle East, The US and Israel Air Forces could, in theory, sustain 1,000 sorties a day over a 100-day campaign. So the logic was kind of straightforward. Iran's launchers would either stay buried in bunkers, strip the IRGC of its retaliatory capacity, or they have to fire rapidly and expose themselves to destruction. However, the plan for Americans were coherent, but the battlefield was not. Two Iranian capabilities has changed the picture. The first was drones. Iran's Shahed-131, with a range of around 900 kilometers, give Tehran something closer to the long-range artillery. The Shahed-136, with a range of roughly 2,500 kilometers, serve actually as a cheap substitute for much more expensive strike system. It almost resembles a cruise missile or a ballistic missile in the strategic effect. Together, they help Iran compensate for what it lacked in both artillery and air power. Throughout history, massive firepower used to be the privilege of rich states, with deep industrial bases and mature supply chains. But now the barrier to entry has been collapsed. The cheap FPV drones, the first-person view drones, and the munitions have taken capabilities that once belonged to great powers and placed them in the hands of far weaker states. That is one of the most important military shifts of the 21st century. The second capacity was on information and precision targeting. For years, American planners had treated the Iranian missile forces as dangerous but imprecise. There was even a dark joke about the IRGC Aerospace Force, that their job was to launch a missile. Whether it actually hits the target was Allah's business. But then, the war has exposed Washington's arrogance. Iran no longer needs to solve the whole precision problem on its own. On March 29th, Tehran has struck the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia and has destroyed 6 KC-135 tankers in a single attack. What made the strike so significant was not just the damage, but the enabling architecture behind it. Iran used the satellite built by a Chinese company named Earth-Eye to guide the attack. Once a private company from a non-belligerent country can help closing the targeting gap, one of America's most comfortable positions of dominance start to erode. And more than that, the consequences spread beyond missile accuracy. It also gave Iran new ways to interfere with American control of the skies. In the opening phase of the war, the United States has knocked out most of Iran's fixed radar sites and air defenses. But the fixed targets are the easy part. The mobile systems are at the next level, especially in a country as vast as Iran. Tehran has acquired the Chinese mobile radar, which is a cutting-edge system, hard to locate and destroy. On March 19th, a US Air Force F-35 was damaged after Iran used the Chinese radar to track its path and launch a heat-seeking missile. So, in high-intensity warfare taking shape today, no platform is untouchable for long. This leads to another question, which is, what exactly makes the high-intensity warfare so punishing today, even to the great powers? At the center of this is a widening imbalance between offense and defense. Drones, cheap strike systems, and the spread of intelligence capacities made it much easier for defenders to impose costs on the attackers. Attackers begin with a built-in political handicap, because every invading army has to keep redefining what victory actually means for its own people. The Iran war made that painfully obvious, because on day one, Donald Trump said the objective was the destruction of the IRGC. Then on day two, it became regime change in Tehran. By day three, it was a defense of Israel. But Iran, by contrast, has faced no such confusion, because for a defender, the victory can be brutally simple: to stay in the fight. As long as Iran can still strike back, America has not won. And there's another shift underway as well, one that may be even more disruptive. It's a growing power of localized and tactical superiority. For most of the modern era, conventional military logic favored the larger state. So India, with its much larger armed forces, had overmatched Pakistan repeatedly throughout the history. Most dramatically, that was happened in 1971 when it helped to split Pakistan in two through the creation of Bangladesh. But during the Operation Sindoor back in May 2025, Pakistan has used the Chinese J-10 fighters armed with its long-range PL-15 missiles and shot down multiple advanced Indian aircrafts, including the French Rafale fighter. Once India no longer has the air superiority, the rest of its military advantages became much harder to utilize. Land forces, naval power, they all degrade when the air superiority disappears. So the initial plan that looked coherent on paper can unravel in a matter of hours. That is why the old fantasy of the quick and smart victory is fading fast. Apart from these special cases where intelligence combined with special operations to achieve victory, such as the US operation to seize Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela in the year of 2026, or the Russian takeover of Crimea in 2014. The only path to victory today for the attackers is the old-fashioned way to attain the numerical superiority. The sheer numbers matter. The most recent example with the clear territorial change was Azerbaijan's victory over Armenia. Back in 2020, Azerbaijan sent roughly 80,000 troops against Armenia's 60,000 and captured about 70% of its disputed territory. In year 2023, it widened the gap further, deploying nearly twice as many forces as its opponent. The result was decisive. Within 24 hours, the separatist regime was crushed. Even there, though, the numbers alone do not tell the full story. Because Azerbaijan could mobilize at scale, it was reclaiming the internationally recognized territory, which has granted the war a defensive political posture, even if the military operations were offensive in nature. Public support is far easier to sustain when a state can just tell its own population that it is taking back its own properties. On the other hand, once that justification disappears, the economics of war starts to bite back. Launching the offensive warfare against territory someone do not own has become extraordinarily expensive. Mobilizing a modern society for that sort of campaign carries the strategic cost of its own. Since the October 7th attacks in 2023, Israel has over-mobilized around 170,000 personnel for ground wars against Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which together filled roughly 80,000 fighters. That 2-to-1 ratio allowed Israel to make gains on the ground. But it also comes with a steep price. The prolonged mobilization already cost Israel nearly 7% of its GDP and has put severe strain on the civilian economy. The burden has been manageable only because of unconditional American support. In reality, the longer defenders can hold out, the more attackers will bleed economically. So in that environment, resistance itself has become a weapon. This new reality means that in any future war, an attacking power must do one of two things: either cripple the defender quickly before the resistance hardens, or sustain the massive economic and the political cost of a long military campaign. In theory, there are two technological ways out of this problem. The first one is through artificial intelligence. The AI-driven targeting could once again make the precision warfare more exclusive, allowing the advanced militaries to destroy highly mobile assets, including those in space. AI could also improve the electromagnetic defense against drones, blunting what has become the poor man's ballistic missile. So the second approach is through the autonomous systems, robots, unmanned systems, uncrewed ships, submarines. This could reduce reliance on the human infantry, lower the political sensitivity to casualties, and reduce the cost of sustaining the offensive campaigns. Their smaller logistic footprint could also help attackers concentrate force while remaining harder to detect. But the technology alone will not be enough. Any such shift will require new training methods, operational doctrines, and above all, a defense industrial base capable of producing these systems in large numbers at a sustainable cost. And even then, the decisive factor remains human: the military command and strategic culture. That is where the real obstacle lies. A generation of senior officers still mentally trapped in the year of 1991, still looking for another Gulf War, another clean and fast victory. The battlefield they now face is very different. In a recent exercise in Estonia, a Ukrainian squad of just 10 infantrymen has utilized the drones to destroy 17 vehicles and has wiped out a NATO mechanized battalion. And that is exactly the warning about how far the character of war has changed already. The next revolution in the military affairs will require more than new technology. It also demands militaries to break with its old habits, procurement logics, and intellectual assumptions of the last era. That is always difficult because the vested interest built by the previous military revolution will not disappear on their own. History suggests they will usually survive until crisis or failure forces change. It only makes this task more urgent. The race to build a truly world-class military in the 21st century will be decided not just by who has the best technology, but by who truly understands the new battlefield. Thanks for watching. This is Curtis at Sinopolitik. See you next time.